Greetings. This week we're talking about education, Macionis chapter 13. How do we pay for public education? High school, middle school, elementary school. Federal funding, in 1980, about 10% of the federal budget went to education. In 1995, 6% of the federal budget went to education. And despite great big programs like No Child Left Behind, it's down to about 3% of the federal budget now. It pays for special programs, remedial programs, programs for disadvantaged students. For example, Project Head Start helps disadvantaged students from preschool onward. It concentrates on reading and math, basic skills. The basis for this is equality of educational opportunity, also known as the Coleman Report from 1968. The important conclusion of this study, which has been replicated in study after study since then, was that the most powerful influence on students' educational success is family background, specifically socioeconomic status. It was found, and is still found, to have a greater effect on student achievement than school resources. Now, this does not mean that schools are unimportant, but it does mean that schools have to work extra hard to overcome the disadvantage of low socioeconomic family backgrounds. Now, if you want to learn more, take my Sociology of Education course. Plug for you there. Most federal funding does not come directly from the federal government to local school districts. Instead, the feds dole out funds, for example, from the No Child Left Behind Act in block grants to each state. The states are then responsible for distributing the funds to local school districts. Most federal monies have a formula component. That is, some percentage of funds must be allotted to schools that have low math and reading scores or high percentages of students on free or reduced meals, etc. A good portion of it, which varies from program to program, will also have a competitive component where schools must write grant proposals to argue why funding their schools would be appropriate. Now, state and local property taxes pay for the remainder of programs, and it can be a large proportion. In low-income school districts, federal funds can account for up to about 85% of funding, with the remainder coming from local property taxes. But in most school districts, well over 65% of funds come from property taxes. The consequence of this, property values vary from school district to school district, and so do the property tax rates. Rural districts can suffer dramatically from this, where property values are low and tax rates are low, thus the revenue, the income that school districts receive is also low. What are some solutions to educational inequality? School choice. Provide vouchers paid for by taxes to parents and allow parents to choose which schools their children will attend, sometimes within one district, sometimes across districts. These programs are supposed to promote parental involvement and promote healthy competition among schools. And in theory, it sounds like a good idea, but there are some downsides to consider. Problem number one, not everyone can go to the best schools. There simply isn't enough room. So there would have to be some kind of selection criteria. Even if these criteria are entirely merit-based, i.e. the students with the best achievement get selected for the best schools, we know from the Coleman Report that this will provide an advantage to children from middle and upper class backgrounds. Problem number two, because we know that parent involvement varies by class, then we can also expect that parent involvement in selecting schools will vary, and it does. Parents from middle and upper class backgrounds are more likely to spend more time investigating the best schools for their children, while parents from lower and working class backgrounds are more likely to take whatever option the school district defaults to, usually standard zoning according to where they live. In short, school choice and voucher programs sound nice, and they are or will be for middle and upper class parents. But the children who need education reforms the most, those from lower and working class families, will most likely suffer from such programs. Another possible solution to educational inequality: fund schools from higher levels than primarily local property taxes. For example, reduce property tax rates and instead institute a state education tax that could be collected and distributed equitably across districts. The problem Higher income bracket constituents often don't feel that it is their responsibility to pay for someone else's education, particularly those folks who don't even have children in school. Another possible solution: increase federal funding to pay for the costs of programs besides just special programs like I described earlier. Problem number one: there are major political battles over the choices in how to spend federal funds. And problem number two: many people feel that the federal government shouldn't have that kind of control over education. Instead, decisions should be left up to the states and or the local school districts. In short, there's no easy solution to making education funding more equal or equitable, and the options available, those I've described and many others, depend largely on each individual's personal philosophy about how to fund and control education. So, what do you think? Give it some thought. The info I've just mentioned and Chapter 13 should clearly show that there is inequality between schools. But what about inequality within schools? One instance of this is tracking, classroom grouping of students according to their perceived abilities and career interests. Three reasons why you do this: students learn better in homogeneous groups, slow learners develop good self concepts and positive outlook on school, and it makes teaching easier and classes more manageable. Those are the three arguments for tracking. But there are consequences of tracking. According to various research, no group of students has ever been found to benefit from being in a homogeneous group. That's not to say that they're disadvantaged, but just that they're not advantaged at all. Homogeneous groups don't do anything. Slow learners are often labeled by teachers and by other students and by themselves as slow. They develop negative self-concepts. The same happens for students in high-track classes, as Richard Rosenthal and Lenore Jacobson demonstrated in 1968. This is fascinating. They gave all 1st through 6th graders at a San Francisco elementary school a written ability test. They gave the scores to the teachers, and then they randomly selected 20% of the students and told the teachers they had unusual intellectual promise. They wanted to see if the teachers would treat these supposedly gifted students differently. At the end of the year, they went back and retested everyone and found that these students, these 20%, had improved their scores on the test twice as much on average as the rest of the students. But again, this 20% of kids had no real advantage. It was all about how the teachers perceived their abilities and thus labeled and treated them differently. General teaching styles also vary by track. High track students tend to spend more time on critical thinking, creative problem solving, the arts, and so on. Low track students spend more time on remedial skills, rote memorization of facts, and skills like how to write a check or how to take care of a household, or in technical skills courses like shop. Annette LaRoe's book, Home Advantage, showed that because student tracking varies by social class, because of parental support at an early age, then we can expect their skills to vary by social class. And Bowles and Gintis, their book Schooling in Capitalist America from 1977, further showed that we teach working class students to develop working class skills, and middle and upper class students to develop their respective skills. Lastly, let's cover briefly the story of desegregation. In 1954, Brown v. the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, ruled that separate was not equal, overturning Plessy versus Ferguson, an 1896 law that said that separate was still equal and had to do with separate seating on a public train. Prior to 1954, people said you could have separate schools for separate groups of kids, specifically by race, and it would still be equal. But African American children in that time were getting less qualified teachers, teaching in dilapidated buildings with secondhand textbooks, and so on and so forth. Brown v. Board said that was not equal in the eyes of the law and insisted that schools be integrated so that all children had access to the same resources. But has desegregation been achieved? Not really. According to recent research, 71% of Hispanic children attend schools where the population is at least half Hispanic. 63% of African American children attend schools where the population is at least half black. Brown ordered desegregation take place with all deliberate speed. That was the language it used. But when states failed to comply, especially in the South, the federal government threatened to withhold all funding from districts or states that did not comply. Most districts responded in the 1970s and 1980s by implementing busing, using school buses to move black children to white schools and vice versa. After about 20 years, it was determined that busing was not having any real effect on increasing African Americans' achievement. Remember, it's more about family background than anything else. Local and state court cases around the country in the late 90s and the early part of this century allowed districts to stop busing as a means of desegregation. So that's it for my intro to Macionis chapter 13. There's a lot to read and to consider in this chapter, and in my opinion, it's fascinating stuff. I hope you agree. So check it out, and I'll see you online.